Okay, so I'm recording. The first thing that I'm going to hit today is we're going to just start where we left off, which we were talking about the dermis, the two main layers of the skin, epidermis and dermis. And we had just reviewed the two layers of the dermis, the deepest layer being the reticular dermis. So I'm going to call up a board for me to draw on and just remind you where we are. We were talking about dermis. We already went over the papillary dermis, which was the first layer, and the second layer. We were talking about reticular dermis, which is the thickest layer of the skin and the deepest layer, made up of dense irregular connective tissue. But before I completely leave reticular dermis, I just wanted to mention that this layer is sort of arranged in collagen bundles. And we can't see these, that's a U, by the way, B-U-N-D-L-E-S. We can't see these bundles from the surface of the skin, but they are there. And occasionally we can see them, depending on the situation, but typically we cannot. They form tension lines throughout the dermis of the skin, or throughout the skin. So these bundles form what surgeons call cleavage lines or tension lines. And they run in different directions depending on the location, the anatomical location of the body. So these cleavage lines tend to run longitudinally, and that means with the midline of the body, really up and down, as you and I would say, but they run longitudinally in the head and in our arms and legs. And then they tend to make a circular bundle collection around the abdomen, or I think your book just says the trunk, neck, and the knees. These collagen bundles sort of collect the skin in directional bundles, and they're important to surgeons in particular, because surgeons use these lines, these bundles, to where they make incisions. So if an incision is cut along one of these bundle lines, that tends to do less damage to the skin during surgery. It also helps with healing. If cut along these lines, the incision tends to heal more quickly and better. Okay, so I wanted to add that onto the dermis. Now I'm going to go straight to sweat glands. So we're still talking about the integumentary system, and sweat glands are a big part of it, structures within the integumentary system. They're also called sudiferous glands. So if you read that or hear me say that, same thing. And we have sweat glands on our entire body, so that in the human form, we find sweat glands everywhere except on external genitalia and nipples of the mammary glands. Everywhere else in the body, we have these sudiferous sweat glands. There's roughly about 3 million, depending on the person, obviously, total on the body within the integumentary system. And there's two main types of sweat glands. So I'm going to go over those fairly quickly. First major type, ECCRINE. It's pronounced eccrine. Eccrine sweat glands are, first, they're merocrine in function. We went over this when we talked about glandular epithelia when we did the epithelial tissues. So merocrine just means that they're not destroyed when they release their secretions. These eccrine glands are the most numerous type on the human body. And they're somewhat simple in their anatomical arrangement. They're a simple glandular structural arrangement, and it's just a coiled gland that opens up to the surface of the skin. So on these sweat glands, we typically just have this coil of glandular cells. There, I'm back. So we have this gland, and it just snakes up to if this is the surface of our skin, the gland duct just snakes up and releases the secretion, which is, I'm going to talk about that. It's mostly water onto the surface of the skin. So let's talk about, I'm just going to move over to this blank white space. I'm still talking about eccrine glands. I just don't want to layer on a whole nother whiteboard for this. So the secretion that is released by eccrine sweat glands is 99% water. So it's mostly water. Some salts, sodium chloride is mixed in there. It also contains typically some vitamin C, antibodies to help fight non-symbiotic, aka bad bacteria on the surface of our skin. It also contains dermacidin, which is just an antibacterial peptide. A peptide is just a short chain of amino acids, and this is antibacterial in nature. Some waste products, depending on the situation in the body, things like ammonia or urea. And finally, the secretions are typically slightly, my board's running out here, so they are slightly acidic in nature. That also helps combat bacteria as well. So these glands, the last thing I'm going to say about eccrine, these are regulated by the sympathetic division of the nervous system. I'm just going to write sympathetic nervous system. That part of, we haven't done the nervous system yet. That part of the nervous system gets turned on usually when we are stressed. You know that you start to sweat when you're stressed out, either from physical stress, from exercising, or emotional stress. All right, I'm gonna layer over this one. I'm gonna go on to another whiteboard and we've done number 1, eccrine, so I'm gonna write number 2, major type of sweat glands. These are called apocrine. A-P-O-C-R-I-N-E. Apocrine sweat glands are much fewer in number. There's only about 2,000 of these, roughly, on the human body. They're found in the axillary region, which is the armpit region, and the urogenital region. These are associated with pubic hair, basically. They are also merocrine in function. That means that the cells are not destroyed during secretion. The ducts empty into follicles, not just to the surface of the skin. The ducts release their secretion into hair follicles. It's the same watery fluid, so it is a water-based fluid as the eccrine glands, I'm just going to write water-based, but there's an extra important ingredient. So plus, so it has the water-based sweat plus a lipid-based and protein-based substance. And in particular, when the lipids and proteins are decomposed by bacteria that live on the surface of our skin, that's what produces body odor. So it's bacteria that decomposes these two substances that then give off body odor. So these glands become active during puberty. So they're hormonally regulated. When we get the surge of our steroid hormones during puberty is when these glands actually become active. They are also controlled or regulated, I'm going to say activated, by the sympathetic nervous system. And so those are the two major types of sweat glands. There's another special one that I'm going to put a star next to it. Ceruminous glands are just modified sweat glands. Ceruminous. Ceruminous glands are just sort of a special form of sweat glands. And they're found in the external ear. Basically, they're modified apocrine glands. And in this area of the body, in the external ear, the secretion that comes out of these apocrine glands mixes with sebum from sebaceous glands to form cerumen, which we call earwax. So I'll write that out for you. Secretion, that means the watery based secretion with the lipids and protein mixes with sebum from sebaceous glands, which I'm going to talk about next. Actually, when I briefly talk about a hair follicle, I'll mention a sebaceous gland. So they mix with sebum to form cerumen, which is where they get their name for the gland. That's what we call earwax. Later, I'm going to layer over this real quickly. I'm not going to say a lot about mammary glands because I'm going to mention them. Mammary glands are just modified, specialized sweat glands that secrete milk. And those will be reviewed in A&P2 when you do the reproductive system. So I'm just going to say modified sweat glands. And they're stimulated by the nervous system as well as the endocrine system, hormones and neural stimulation. All right, so I've gone over sweat glands, sebaceous glands, which are associated with hair follicles, are technically not a sweat gland, but they're part of the integumentary system. These are oil glands that empty into a hair follicle, and then the secretions go up to the skin from there. So if I have time, I'll draw a hair follicle toward the end of this lecture. But these are pretty much found everywhere. They're associated with hair follicles, so everywhere we have hair. So found everywhere except the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. and they congregate. We have high concentrations of them, particularly on the face, neck, and the upper chest. These glands secrete a substance called sebum, which is an oily-based substance, not a water-based substance. The cells burst when they're destroyed during secretion, so these are called holocrine glands. So the cells are destroyed during secretion, and the secretory, the remnants of the secretory cells are actually released with the secretion itself. There's a smooth muscle called an erector pili muscle that assists in the secretion. Process. Okay, so I'm going to call it quits on glands there because I need to hit so many topics today. I'm going to jump to the major functions of the integumentary system. And I'm going to list them as 6 major functions. First and foremost, protection. So we say that the skin mostly, but also the secretions of glands and hair provide a physical, chemical, and biological barrier. So let's just write that out. A chemical barrier is provided by the integumentary system through secretions. Things like acidic secretions provide a chemical barrier. Another example, let's just write this out. These are examples of chemical barrier. Acidic secretions, melanin secreted by melanocytes provides a chemical barrier against UV rays of the sun damage. So these things help control bacteria, they're antimicrobial, and also I'll just write UV protection. We know that the skin also provides a physical barrier, mostly from tight junctions of those keratinocytes in the stratum corneum, but there are those waterproofing glycolipids from the stratum granulosum that provide a protective physical barrier. Let me write that out. So physical barrier. The tight junctions of the stratum corneum, those dead cells, when we bump into something, that protects our skin. When something scratches us or abrades us. Also, this would include the physical barrier, a waterproofing barrier of the glycolipids from the granulosum, help keep fluids out, and also help keep our moisture in, helps prevent desiccation. And finally, I'm running out of space, so I'm just going to put a letter C over here, a biological barrier. That refers to things like, I'll give examples. Macrophages, these are cells, mostly immune cells, by the way. Macrophages, dendritic cells, they're both immune fighting cells that fight infection. And also, our DNA can convert UV radiation into heat. So electrons in the DNA can actually convert UV radiation into heat, but mostly it's these immune cells that provide a biological barrier. So that's number 1, protection. Number 2, major function of the integumentary system, and try to remember to go in the order of your book. temperature regulation. So just basically helps warm us, the heating, and vasoconstriction to the surface. So vasoconstriction, that means restricting blood flow to the surface of the skin can conserve heat. When we go outside on a really cold day, the blood vessels within the surface of our integumentary system constrict, restricting blood flow to our skin. That helps keep deep body heat within us. There's also, as you know, cooling mechanisms, mostly through sweating. The process of sweating, releasing these excretions from sweat glands onto the surface of our body, is a cooling process. Evaporation of that fluid cools the body surface. All right, so temp control, let's do number 3. Sensation, which is mostly in conjunction with the nervous system. So we have sensory receptors in the integumentary system. Those are called exteroceptors, which are just a special class of sensory receptors that monitor the external environment, the outside world. They're just coiled nerve endings on the surface of the skin, and they're mostly tactile. That means touch receptors. And deep touch, which are, so the Meissner corpuscles are tactile. I'm just going to put tactile, and deep pressure. Just to remind you, the names of these Meissner's corpuscles are tactile, deep pressure are called Pacinian. They're associated more with pain receptors. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about number 3, just because I have so much to say today. Number 4, metabolism is usually number 4 on the list. This is complicated. Ultraviolet light from the sun, when it hits our skin, skin cells produce what we say is the inactive form of vitamin D. So I'm going to write vitamin D in an inactive form. This inactive form of vitamin D then goes to the kidneys, where it's converted to the active form of vitamin D. So our skin actually produces vitamin D. So some sunlight is good. It's good and bad. The UV rays are the number one cause or risk for skin cancer. So overexposure to the sun is bad, but we need exposure to some sun in order to produce vitamin D. Those who don't produce enough vitamin D in their skin, it's necessary that they ingest it. That's why dairy products are fortified with vitamin D to make sure that we get enough of it. Nevertheless, here's the pathway. So the sunlight hits the skin. Skin cells produce an inactive form of vitamin D, which travels to the kidneys. That inactive form is converted to the active form of vitamin D. And so what? What does vitamin D do? Vitamin D then enhances calcium absorption in the small intestine. It's a complicated process, and I'll bring this back up again when we talk about the skeletal system. That's going to be the calcium connection. And in AMP2, when you're talking about the digestive system in the small intestine, that will bring up the absorption function as well. But the chain of reaction goes UV light from the sun, skin cells produce vitamin D in an inactive form, kidneys convert that to an active form of vitamin D. Without the active form of vitamin D, our intestine doesn't absorb the calcium that we ingest, and we don't get enough calcium into our system, which is why we have fortified most of our calcium products that we ingest with vitamin D. So you're getting 2 for 1. You're intaking calcium and vitamin D at the same time. All right, let's move on to number 5. We're almost finished. Number 5 function. The skin or the integumentary system can act as a blood reservoir. That just means that it can hold, the skin can hold up to 5% of the body's blood volume at any given time, and it can release it as needed. And number 6, it can act as an excretion system. We can get rid of waste, things that we don't need. Small amounts of nitrogenous waste in sweat, mostly. So I'm just going to put, the skin can excrete or get rid of urea, ammonia. The kidneys do most of this, by the way. The skin does this in a much smaller amount. That's supposed to say uric acid. And some sodium, and of course water. All right, so we've done the 6 major functions of the skin. I am going to talk about skin color, how we get our skin pigmentation. So this is a new topic, and it's very brief, by the way. So this is determined by really 3 main factors. The amount of melanin that our melanocytes produce. All humans have the same relative number of melanocytes in their skin. It's just people with more pigmented skin, their melanocytes are more active. It's not that they have more melanocytes, they're just more active. So melanin produced by melanocytes, as you know, the melanocytes are found in the stratum basale of the epidermis. Keratin also helps determine skin color, particularly in people who don't produce a lot of melanin. So keratin is ingested in foods. It's not produced naturally in the skin. I'm not sure. I don't have my book in front of me. Probably yes. I'm not going in perfect order. So I just wanted to hit, the short answer is yes. I'm not going in perfect order of the book. I try to do that as best as possible, but I'm also most concerned about hitting what I think are the most complicated topics. And this is not one of them, so I'm going to gloss through this. Ingested in foods, keratin is particularly things high in vitamin A. Example would be carrots. And this, it has an orangey red color to it. The more keratin-ridden foods that we eat, the more reddish our skin takes, the more reddish hue. And finally, hemoglobin is a factor in skin color. Hemoglobin is a protein that when it's found in our bloodstream, in red blood cells, and when it binds oxygen, it turns bright red. So this also influences skin color, especially in fair-skinned people. So there are a lot of capillaries close to the surface of the skin that can be shown, especially in fair-skinned people. And hemoglobin, when oxygen is bound to it, produces a bright red, and that also can give the skin sort of a red or pinkish hue to it. So these three main factors, melanin, carotene, and hemoglobin, really determine the skin color of a particular individual. Now, I am jumping around a little bit in chapter 5 because I want to hit as many of these topics as I can. I'm going to draw a hair follicle and explain the basics of it to you. This is the surface of the skin. A hair follicle penetrates way down deep into the skin itself. If we designate, here's our line between 5 layers of the epidermis and the dermis up here. You can see that hair follicles typically penetrate way down deep into the dermal layers of the skin. However, around the wall of the follicle itself, epidermal tissue continues to surround the follicle like this. So everything in blue is epidermis, and epidermal tissue surrounds the follicle deep down into the dermis, and we call this jacket the epidermal sheath of the hair follicle. So it's technically epidermal cells that surround the hair follicle, even though the follicle itself is located deep down here in the deep dermis of the skin. So everything in red is dermal tissue. I'm drawing mostly reticular dermis here. And the reason I'm doing this is because at the very base of the hair follicle, there is a penetrating lump of dermal tissue that sticks up into the base of the hair follicle. And we call that the dermal papilla because it means finger-like, and it sticks up into the base of the hair follicle like this. So everything in red is dermis, everything in blue is epidermis, and this would be the epidermal sheath. And the hair itself, the actual hair, I'm going to use black, grows around this dermal papilla, and then just like stem cells in the stratum basale of the epidermis, there are actively mitotic cells. I'm just calling up a different color in this area. I'm going to color them green. Those are actively mitotic dividing cells that give rise to new hair cells. So that's where the hair growth occurs. In this area that I've drawn where the green cells are is called the hair matrix. The hair matrix is where we, A, have new cellular growth, constant mitosis, mitotic cellular division that gives rise to new cells. But just like in the skin, as those older cells get pushed up this direction, they die very quickly. And the hair, as you know, comes up out of the skin like this. This would be the hair shaft that we can see on the outer surface of the skin. This would be the hair root. And finally, you know why. This is called the hair bulb, B-U-L-B, because of its bulbous shape. But this hair matrix is a very special region, and I'm going to use my black pen. There are also melanocytes in the hair matrix. So there's stem cells giving rise to new hair cells, as well as melanocytes that give pigmentation to our hair, give us our hair color. And these cells quickly die as they leave the hair matrix region, and they're dead by the time they get to that cells are dead by the time they get to the root region, and completely dead up here. That's why when we cut our hair, we feel nothing. The cells are dead and we have no nerve endings up there. But well, I'm going to draw some nerve endings now. I'll use yellow. This area of the dermal papilla is full of nerve endings and blood vessels. The blood vessels supply nutrition to those stem cells, and the nerve endings, when you pull on your hair up here, it yanks these sensory nerve endings, and it can hurt and you feel pain. It can also rupture some capillaries in that region, and it is possible to get a drop of blood out on the surface of the follicle. So the follicle itself, this word follicle, just refers to this entire structure, really this encasement that a hair grows in, this cavity. But it includes all of these structures. The epidermal sheath, and there's layers to that I don't have time to go into right now. This dermal papilla, the hair matrix, the specific areas of the hair itself. I'm going to need to erase a little bit of this because I want to show you how first a sebaceous gland is. Just going to erase some of my dermal tissue here and draw a sebaceous gland. One of those oil-based glands. They sort of look like this in structure, and the duct empties directly. So a sebaceous gland is associated with almost every hair follicle. I think for certain every hair follicle on the human body. We get more of these glands with each follicle depending on the location. So when I just told you that they're concentrated in the hair, sort of the hair, neck, the face, neck, and upper chest region, that just means each follicle has more of these glands associated with it. So this sebum, this oil-based secretion, is released into this space, and that oil-based secretion called sebum moisturizes the hair itself as well as the skin surface around the follicle. So it is kind of funny that we spend all day long scrubbing the oil off of our skin, only to then reapply moisturizing lotions and creams to do what this gland was designed to do physiologically. So I wanted to show that structure, and I need to erase a little bit of the dermal tissue on this side, and I'm going to draw in red because it's a muscle. That erector pili muscle that I mentioned earlier, that's associated, that actually helps with the excretion process of the sebaceous gland. It has even a more important function, this erector. So I'm drawing a muscle associated with this hair follicle, and I'll label it. It's called an erector pili muscle. And that muscle is a smooth muscle. That means we don't have conscious control over its contractions. So it's a smooth muscle. The sympathetic nervous system regulates the contraction of this muscle as well. And when it contracts, it causes our hair, here's the surface of the skin. When it's relaxed, our hairs tend to be laying down like this. When that muscle contracts, it makes our hair stand up on end like this. So they contract when we're cold, and our hair standing up helps conserve the warm air close to our skin, so it helps conserve body heat. And they also contract when we are really stressed out or frightened. If you've ever had the hair stand up on the back of your neck, it's more apparent in animals like cats and dogs. When they're threatened, these erector pili muscles all over their body contract and their fur stands up, and that gives the impression of that they're larger, and it's a threatened type of response in a lot of mammals. Okay, so I wanted to go over the basics of a hair follicle, and last but not least, and you can ask me any questions, by the way, at the end of this, but I want to go over tissue repair because a student emailed me about that. So before I completely leave the integumentary system, I would like to remind you, I'll say this to you on recording. I'm not going to ask you many questions about the structure of a nail, a fingernail, because it's almost the same. The structures are almost the same as a hair follicle. So definitely review the hair follicle. There's a good diagram in your book. There's several photomicrographs, which just means a picture of a microscope slide in your book as well. So go over the structures, the types of hair growth, the vellus hair as opposed to a terminal hair. I just don't have time in this hour Zoom meeting to go over every single word in the textbook. Before I leave the skin, make sure that you go over skin cancer, okay? There's 3 major types of skin cancer. Basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, as well as melanoma, malignant melanoma. Review these types and their names and what layer of the skin and what cells of the skin are affected. Metastasis or metastasis refers to cancer cells that travel to another part of the body and usually take up host there in another organ. So many cancers, including skin cancer, are not life-threatening in the original organ where they start. Same with breast cancer. Breast cancer itself in the breast does not cause death. It's when it metastasizes or metastasis to a different organ, a vital organ in the human body. For example, malignant melanoma, that starts in the skin, and that just means uncontrolled cellular growth of our melanocytes. The problem is that uncontrolled mitotic cellular growth, the life-threatening problem is those cells travel, if they get to our body fluids, they will travel somewhere else in the human body, just like breast cancer cell. And if they travel to a vital organ, in the case of malignant melanoma, that would be the brain. Melanoma likes to metastasize to the brain. And when those cancer cells, those uncontrolled melanoma cells, set up shop in our brains, they choke off brain function, and that's really the cause of death. So review those. All right, I'm going to totally switch gears here and do one last topic. I'm going back to the tissue section because a student specifically asked me to do this, and I'm just going to review tissue repair. Because yes, I will ask you some questions about this on the next quiz. There's 2 basic ways that tissue repairs, 2 major ways, and those are called regeneration and or fibrosis. This one, regeneration, just think of replacing new original tissue with the same like tissue. So this is just replacing the original with the exact same type of tissue. That's supposed to be a W. Fibrosis, always think of scar tissue. When fibrosis occurs, we get this tough fibrous connective tissue that replaces the original tissue. Now, which type of repair occurs after tissue damage totally depends on, so I'm going to write this out, type of repair after damage depends on really 2 things. The original type of tissue that was damaged and the severity of the injury. So that dictates whether regeneration and how much of it occurs, and whether fibrosis and how much of it occurs. Typically, only certain tissues and very, very non-severe injuries do we get complete regeneration and no fibrosis. So oftentimes we get a combination of regeneration and fibrosis in our tissue repair process. So there's a series of events that typically occurs during tissue repair in this chronological order. First is inflammation. After injury or damage, we get a whole process of inflammation around the injury. So what happens is the damaged tissue, literally the cells of damaged tissue release chemicals, which starts off the process of inflammation. They're called tissue factors, by the way. We also, so I'm just going to write tissue factors, which are released chemicals that come directly from the damaged cells, sort of start this process. And then immune cells, those non-specific immune cells called macrophages, they get attracted to the area and they start to help prevent infection. And mast cells also release chemicals to mediate the inflammation. Capillaries dilate. So we get what that means is we get an increase in blood flow to that damaged tissue area. And finally, hemostasis occurs. That just means the formation of a blood clot. So that's step one. Now, step two is really the start of the repair process itself. And we call this the organization step. So organization ensues or begins, and this is the layering of new tissue onto the damaged area. So the blood clot from hemostasis in step one gets replaced by granular tissue. We've all experienced granular tissue. Granular tissue is that really bright pink, tender tissue that we see around the area of a damaged, our damaged skin, for example. So if you get a cut or a scrape and the repair process begins, this granular tissue is usually that bright pink, delicate stuff. This granular tissue also contains, we get the growth of a new capillary bed. So we actually get a miniature new blood supply to that area. Fibroblasts release chemicals called growth factors. They are hormone-like chemicals that stimulate tissue growth. Fibroblasts also secrete collagen fibers. And finally, macrophages end up digesting. This granular tissue sort of pushes off that blood clot, that hematoma that was first formed in step one. And also macrophages, they sort of digest that blood clot from the deeper tissue. So sometimes this granular tissue can then become what we call scar tissue, Depends on the severity of the injury. I'm going to write can become scar tissue and or new original tissue. So step number 3 just is signifying or delineating how much regeneration and how much fibrosis occurs. So this, remember, is the replacement of original tissue. This is forming of scar tissue. And new-like cells can push the scab off, the hematoma off. And regenerated epithelium has some fibrous scar tissue deep to it, no matter what. But oftentimes, depending on if it's a really severe injury and in tissue that does not have high regenerative capabilities, we get almost completely scar tissue in that area. So on that note, so for example, in simple infections, usually mostly regeneration occurs. But in severe infections or severe trauma, like if you get a bad deep wound, we get much more fibrosis occurring in something like our skin. I do want to go over tissue, the categories of tissue repair capabilities. And this is my last whiteboard of the day. And I'm just gonna, I believe your book does this. I don't have my textbook in front of me. They categorize different tissues in the human body, and now that you know all of them, based on their regenerative capabilities. So highly regenerative tissues include these specific types. Epithelial, bone, believe it or not. We're going to study bone starting tomorrow, actually, and all next week. The reason bone is highly regenerative because it has a super rich blood supply and nerve supply. Some connective tissues that are highly regenerative, areolar connective tissue, irregular, dense irregular, I'll write that. CT is highly regenerative. Blood, you know now that that's a fluid connective tissue. And blood stem cells are also highly regenerative as well in the marrow. So next category, not quite as regenerative as the ones that I listed in highly regenerative, but they still have moderate regenerative capabilities. That would be smooth muscle that we find lining our organs and vessel walls, tendons, and some ligaments, more tendons than ligaments. So I'm just going to write dense, regular CT. Weaker than that would be things like skeletal muscle. So if we get deep lacerations or we have deep surgery that they have to go through a lot of skeletal muscle has weak regenerative capabilities, usually forms fibrosis more than it does regeneration. So skeletal muscle and cartilage are both weak capabilities. Skeletal muscle is kind of curious to me because most of our skeletal muscles do have high vascularization. Finally, none. No regenerative capabilities are the heart. So cardiac muscle. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but once cardiac tissue is ischemic for very long, is without oxygen, it dies very quickly, and we're not getting that back, those damaged cells or tissue. Same with the central nervous system. You've probably heard that. When your brain cells die, that's it. You're not getting any new ones back. And that's pretty much true. There is just super limited evidence that any central nervous tissue regeneration occurs after injury or damage. We do have some nervous tissue capabilities of repair out in the peripheral nervous system, depending on the severity of the injury. So if you get nerve damage out in your arms, your hands, your legs, your feet, away from the brain and spinal cord, we can get some regenerative capabilities in those areas. All right, guys, I am going to stop the recording on my end